One reason people dismiss the possibility that the September 11th attack was a government operation is that they cannot believe everybody in the U.S. government would remain silent about such an incredible crime. A woman named Kay Griggs, the second wife of Marine Corps Colonel George Griggs, can help us understand why everybody is silent. Her information about the U.S. government comes from her husband, her personal observations, her husband's diary, and people she met. Even if some of her information is incorrect, the top military and political leaders of America are routinely blackmailed, bribed, threatened, and manipulated. She mentions many government officials by name, so if her accusations are false, she is making a lot of slanderous remarks about a lot of people. For example,
I found my husband's diary, which I have here, which they have been not anxious to have get out.
Uh-huh. No, they meaning?
General Sheehan, General Krulak, Marine Corps colonels, generals, Al Gray, Cook, and especially General Joy.
Joy.
General Jim Joy
Uh-huh.
and General Carl Steiner they're evil men. And they are in this diary meeting with my husband almost every day in Beirut. They trained the men in black who killed those people in Waco.
not only does she claim that Waco was a deliberate killing, but later in the interview she says that the military knew that the Marine Corps barracks was going to be bombed in Beirut, Lebanon. That bombing occurred in 1983, and more than 200 Marines died. The official story is that the bombing was a result of Arab terrorists. She doesn't explain why the military would allow hundreds of Marines to die, so we are left to wonder if the bombing was intended to give the Marines an excuse to get out of Lebanon, or if it was intended to create anger towards Arabs. As with the September 11th attack, the Oklahoma City bombing, and the killings at Waco, it is difficult to find a sensible motive. But perhaps Kay Griggs is correct that many top government officials are under the control of criminals and lunatics. She explains that one of the methods to control government officials is to pressure them into doing unusual sexual activities, which can then be used to blackmail them. She believes that some universities have special fraternities for this purpose. For example, Princeton University has a fraternity called Cap and Gowns, which her husband belonged to. Yale University has a fraternity called Skull and Bones. Supposedly, President Bush and John Kerry were members of that fraternity. To most people, and to some of its members, these fraternities are meaningless organizations, but she believes some of them are used as recruitment centers for government officials.
George got into Cap and Gown, which is the same kind of fraternity. I mean, it's an eating club at Princeton for intelligence officers.
It's Cap and Gown. Would they have anybody involved that wasn't intelligence oriented?
Football players and so forth. But I have a feeling that Cap and Gown has a lot of intelligence officers and boys who may have been raped. Of course, they'd never talk about it.
Right.
But I know that the initiation is they get very drunk, and even in the Marine Corps they do that. It's called dining in. They have the shellback ceremony. They do a lot of homosexual enticement. The boys are, when they come in, when they're new recruits, they strip them nude, they violate their personal parts. There's a lot of that is going on.
What about
even now?
Tailhook?
Yeah.
Is there a connection?
Yeah, sure, because the cream of the crop is doing this, they're having group sex
And
parties.
that was a Navy operation too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
She points out that tailhook has a double meaning.
You know what tailhook means, don't you?
No, what is tailhook? Uh-oh. I got a feeling.
Yeah.
Is it a homosexual reference?
Yeah, sure.
Really?
Sure.
Did you know that, Steve? Isn't it something?
Yeah.
And the average person on the street has no idea.
No.
She accuses a Marine Corps general of being a cherry Marine.
What I want to tell you about General Al Gray, my husband was the chief of staff for General Al Gray, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps. And I probably shouldn't say this on the tape, and you all can get rid of it, but he's a homosexual.
Gray.
Gray.
Okay.
He's what they call a cherry Marine.
She then describes the initiation ceremonies in more detail and noticed that her husband is one of the sources of this information.
I mean, if this really got out, that these guys are all inducted because they've got some kind of homosexual thing on them.
Indoctrination. I mean, or induction. They have to do that.
Yeah.
They do that.
Yeah. Even
in a coffin. And it's even now coming into the military totally. The chiefs do that. They put them in the coffin. They do the bowling ball trick.
Okay, you got to explain this. What happens when you get in the coffin? Why do you get in a coffin?
Oh, they get, when you get your eagles, that's a German thing.
Okay.
You know, it's what the German high command did, and most of them, you know, had the boyfriends and stuff, the Krupps and all of that. It is a German thing that they say goes back to Greece, and it's all the male Marine-looking men that they do it with. So now the chiefs have to do that. What they do is George said it's like a zoo. They get everybody really drunk, and they sometimes call it dining in. Shellback is another time that they do it. Not everybody does it, but the ones who do it, if they're young, they get right up to the top. It's a...
Okay, well, what actually do they do? They've got a coffin, they get inside
anal sex. That. They put them in the coffin and they do things.
Okay, they perform things on each other.
Yeah, while they're all around there going drunk.
I see. So there's a guy in the coffin.
Yeah, and he's the one who
is the recipient of all the acts.
Right, right.
Yeah. Probably safe to conclude these are oral sex acts on this guy or something like that. Okay.
Yeah, oral and anal, whatever.
Yeah.
But
what's the significance of the coffin?
I don't know.
Although she never explained what the bowling ball trick is, you should ask yourself, would a top military official, or any other man, tell his wife that he was pressured into joining these bizarre ceremonies if they were not true? Not every man in the military is enthusiastic about homosexual sex, so there are also orgies with women.
These orgies are going on all over the Mediterranean, that the captains, lieutenants, the men who rise to the top are the ones who are picked to play the games, the pool parties, the nude pool parties. And they have secretaries who come in. I've talked to 3 guys, and of course my husband, who went to these parties. But what they do is, and this is General Al Gray, who was the main prime mover, they would go to a place like Aix-les-Rosés, where Charles Caddock, this teacher who inducted, got my husband into it, he retired in one of these all-male party houses on the Mediterranean. I mean, that's where and my husband kept up with him all through the years.
But these sex parties and orgies, they're all homosexual in nature, or is there some heterosexual?
They start off with the wild secretaries. It's kind of, you know, my husband did those in Indonesia. He did them at a place in Northern Virginia with his first wife.
She was told by military leaders and their wives that this is normal.
What percentage do you think of these higher-up people are bisexual?
Oh, all of them. If they're in special operations, if they're Marines, they're all bisexuals. They've all had to do it in order to get to be a bird colonel. The SEALs. It's kind of like the fast road to the top. Now.
So a guy could not be a SEAL without having.
Oh, I don't believe so. Mm-hmm. I haven't met one that I don't believe would have done it. And judging from what a couple of colonels told me, it's just, that's the norm. It's just you women, you know, y'all are so sissy, y'all are just, you know, you don't understand how it is. We're under so much pressure. And when Valerie Wilhelm told me that about Charlie, I just could not believe what
Charlie Wilhelm would be a...
He's a general now down in Miami. And she was just saying, oh, well, you know, he's run around. He has to, she said. He's under so much pressure. And she was saying that, of course, I had met Charlie in Norway, and Charlie is sort of someone my husband just idolizes. And and Michael O'Boyle is another one. Michael is my husband's special friend.
After watching all 8 hours of her interview, when I see a top government official, I find myself wondering, did this guy get his promotion because he joined in on the homosexual sex? What about this guy? Or him? This one? Do the Air Force generals do it also? Kay Griggs implies that General Al Gray enjoys the homosexual sex, but I would expect some of the men to become fed up with it after a certain number of years. After all, how many times would you have to be pressured into homosexual acts before you refused to do it? Whoever has control of the U.S. government has to deal with the men who become rebellious. Kay Griggs suspects that murder was used to keep her husband under control.
And you see, my husband is frightened to death. I believe that his brother was murdered to keep him in, because he had gone through 4 years of this mind control. And the man who did it, you can see this on the video, his name was Charles Caddick, and another man named Alexander Robinson.
She also suspects other people were murdered, such as former CIA Director William Colby. She also mentions the technique of condemning a person to a mental institution, which almost happened to a person named Bob.
There were a couple of others. Paisley, who was murdered almost like this other man. Paisley was murdered like William Colby. Paisley was also hanging around with homosexuals. He went to the Rush River Lodge. That is the one. So did Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward, you know.
The reporter?
Yeah, yeah. Henry Kissinger was a well-known, totally a homosexual, not even both ways.
And so his wife is a marriage of...
oh, it's just a convenience. Yeah, and he might, you know, maybe he's discovered women in his late age, I don't know. But, no, I heard through a very well-grounded German that Henry's best friend's father told Henry to stay away from him, and that's why Henry left. The family were embarrassed, and Henry went to Britain, where they did this, and then changed his name from Heinz to Henry. And I interviewed a man named Bob, who's an Army enlisted person who told me about Henry in Cambodia. So he, up through Cambodia, he was actually raping young men. And of course, that experience destroyed the lives of these 5 young men, according to the source. I mean, he said he was crying, and this man was a perfectly wonderful, functioning, young married man who worked for a newspaper on the Eastern Shore and had 3 young children, went to Vietnam as an enlisted man, was put in Cambodia, which he said it was a lie living there, and then ran into Henry Kissinger, or Henry Kissinger ran into him and did certain things to him, invited him into his tent with some other men. It was horrible, but it was, you know, he said it's wartime and so forth. But he said, you know, I could have taken it mentally if it had been a bunk. I think they're trying to destroy America.
Let's listen to more accusations before trying to understand who they are.
And keep in mind, my husband is infamous. Princeton graduate, chief of staff for Al Gray, who runs all the dirty tricks for the Army. You know, Linda Tripp worked for Carl Steiner, who was a partner of, you know, Jim Joy and Carl Steiner and my husband were the triumvirate in Beirut.
Okay.
And Linda Tripp worked for Carl Steiner down there.
This would be approximately
In the, I think in the 80s. She and her husband were both Delta Force duos. They send them, but then they divorced, so that broke up that. But she's a dirty tricks person, Linda.
She believes that Linda Tripp was helping to set President Clinton up for blackmail. She also claims that the U.S. military was manipulated during the 1991 Iraqi war for purposes of selling weapons, smuggling drugs, and laundering money.
It's kind of like Monica and Bill. I think they put Monica in there to have something on Bill. That's my own feeling. Sarah McClendon feels the same way. Because...
And Linda Tripp was there to guide the situation.
Absolutely. Of course. Linda Tripp was Delta Force. Linda Tripp was trained by Carl Steiner, who's in the diary with my husband. Carl Steiner is called a snake. And he tried to trip up Schwarzkopf. I mean, he was trying to take the whole Iraqi thing over because they had been baiting, you know, using the Israeli rogues in Turkey. They were having little zigzag wars. It's all to sell weapons. It's all about weapon sales. It's all about drugs. It's all about funny money.
Most people assume that the U.S. military wanted the Vietnam War, but she claims that the military was pushed into Vietnam by the same group who were behind the bombing of Dresden during World War II. She supports the accusation that the American military was fooled into bombing Dresden simply to slaughter the German civilians. She also supports the accusation in Michael Piper's book, Final Judgment, that some Israelis were the masterminds of the President Kennedy assassination.
You didn't used to kill women and children in war when the British Army, when they were pure kind of, you didn't go out and kill. I think Dresden, they did do some of that, but that was Walt Whitman Rostow and his crowd. And he's a very dangerous man, because Walt Whitman Rostow is a communist.
Okay, and in what capacity is he?
Oh, he was one of the wise men in Kennedy's administration. I think he was probably responsible for the movement that got Kennedy murdered. I believe it was an Israeli group which did it with some of these rogues. Walt Whitman Rostow was the one who got us into the Vietnam War because he wanted to sell the weapons and stuff. He and Victor Krulak, who is the present commandant's father, Krulak was his lackey. Walt Whitman Rostow's lackey. Walt Whitman Rostow went with Taylor, General Taylor, and wrote the report that got us into the Vietnam War. And all the time that the Pentagon was saying no, 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 he was a cheerleader for the weapons sales. He and Henry Kissinger. He and Henry. Walt Whitman Rostow, Eugene Debs Rostow, these were communists, named for communists. Eugene Debs Rostow and it's either his son or his other brother, runs the big Boston mob, the port there. His name is Nicholas Rostow.
She claims that the war in Bosnia was also manipulated by these people, and that the CIA is not as important as we assume it is. She believes that most of the secret operations are coming from a group of criminals working within our military and NATO. Sometimes she refers to them as the joint.
The war in Bosnia is simply a stage to train assassins, to be a market for brand new weapons, to be a marketplace so that the drug money can be used. And the Army runs the whole show. It's totally run by the Army. The CIA is a bogus thing. You know, it's Training and Doctrine Command. It's NATO. It's SHAPE. Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, started by Eisenhower. It's a totally independent corporation. Its main function is to sell weapons and launder money.
You're talking about CIA?
No, I'm talking about SHAPE.
SHAPE. Okay.
CIA is kind of bogus. I mean,
that's just
there.
A trade name for the media
to use. Oh, it's to
confuse
confuse us. It's just to get us off the track. It's all being done by Army people who are now joint.
She describes the joint as being in New York and that it acts as a funding organization for their criminal activities.
The funding organization, one of the funding organizations was out of New York, and it was called the Joint. And Meyer Lansky, see, our mob, the organized crime, the Jewish Kabbalist group.
Unlike the gangsters of Al Capone's era, Meyer Lansky and his friends can manipulate entire nations rather than just a few cities. In this next segment, she mentions that one of the operations that the Joint was funding was the illegal immigration of Nazis into America. Since she describes the Joint as being Jewish, your first thought might be to assume that they were helping Jews escape Nazi Germany. However, what she describes may be what other people refer to as Operation Paperclip, although she does not use that expression. She is going to mention that many of these Nazis had the German disease, and she refers to them as the Pink Triangle Boys. She is referring to homosexuality and sex with children. The Nazi Party had the same problem that the Republican Party suffers from. Specifically, there are a lot of accusations that many top Nazi and Republican leaders are homosexual, that some are raping children on a regular basis, and that some are covering up the slave trade. In Nazi Germany, some of the rapists and homosexuals were arrested and put into prison camps, and pink triangles were put on their uniforms to identify them from the other prisoners. She believes that thousands of these Pink Triangle Boys were brought to America at the end of World War II. She also claims that the Nazi government was brought down by the German people when reports about the raping of children started spreading through the population. This seems to be happening right now with the Bush administration. The Jeff Gannon incident seems to be forcing a lot of people to face the possibility that many top government officials are not what they claim to be.
This funding group in New York, they would pay for passports which were illegal, and in fact, my grandfather was involved with that. That's how I know so much about it, because my grandfather was told to keep silent and not to tell anybody, but of course he told my grandmother, and my grandmother told me, and I've told my children. Everybody knows they brought in probably more than 200,000 Nazi soldiers and SS and, you know, wacko scientists and psychologists, and all of them, most of them, had the German disease, you know, because it was their culture.
The German disease?
Yeah, the German disease is what the Pink Triangle Boys were. Colonel Ron Ray writes about this. He's a Marine colonel who's a Christian who's writing about the Cherry Marines, the homosexuality in the group sex orgies and so forth, which brought down the German government, because Naples, which is where all of the Navy is doing their playing, I mean, today in Naples, these orgies are going on. It was where Krupp, the weapons manufacturer, used to take the German high command, and they would go into on the Isle of Capri into the Blue Grotto. And they would have big orchestras, and they'd bring in little boys, little Italian boys, who would be raped. They'd give them trinkets. And, of course, the mothers gradually found out, and just like me, it was one thing when there was just one of me. Now there are a lot more of us wives who were talking and telling truth. And it took those Italian women went to newspapers in Italy. They wouldn't listen. But when they went to the wives of these guys in Germany, it brought it all out. It brought the German government down because they were duplicitous in it, you know. But what they were doing was pedophilia. They were raping, bringing in little boys. They involved the Catholic priests, you know, who were bringing in all. Anyway, so, but what happened was this whole group came over to the United States. And they, it's an old culture, but it is the reason there are a lot of things going on with children these days. And it explains why it's all being covered up, because if you've got police officers who are playing these games and they're going in the woods like to, what is this place where, I mean, even Eisenhower played these games. Even Mike Kemp out in, it's called the Hermitage.
The Hermitage.
In California, where they all they get drunk and they run around nude in the woods and stuff.
Bohemian Grove kind of
That's
thing.
it, Bohemian Grove.
Okay,
Bohemian.
rather than Hermitage, it's the Bohemian Grove?
Bohemian Grove, that's the name of it.
My
brain's tired.
That's okay.
And the one in, there was a big one in Washington called Rush River Lodge, where they used to all go, and there are lots of places now. But the problem, as I see it, is that I think they're trying to destroy America.
She also accuses Caspar Weinberger of being part of this group of criminals.
They're selling weapons. I mean, that's what the military is doing. It's totally controlled by the mob. Look at this. Weinberger was General Douglas MacArthur's. He spied on MacArthur in Korea. Who was MacArthur's nemesis? Albatross. It was none other than little old intelligence. I'm going to tell every move you make. Weinberger. Young, but he did it. He brought down MacArthur. Every move MacArthur was going to make, he broadcast it through the chaplain, his little intelligence network. And he got brownie points with the group because he brought down the big lion. When you get rid of a big lion like that, you get a big job. You've done good work. And they needed to get rid of MacArthur because he didn't want to keep the wars going. He wanted it over, and you know, it's like General Trefay, who took over after the Vietnam War was over, and he was on C-SPAN in August of '96 with former Ambassador Whitehead and a few of the other the State Department Vietnam people. And General Trefay, he had been holding this in for years. He was on C-SPAN. This man let it all out. He said, I took over at the end of the Vietnam War. I was in control, right? Big general charge. So I say, cut off the shipment of weapons. So I tell the Pentagon, cut off the shipment of weapons. He said, I got a phone call from Henry Kissinger saying the weapons are going to continue at the wartime rate.
Just when you think you've heard the strangest accusation possible, she comes up with another one that's even more difficult to believe. For example, she claims that some communist dictators were also put through the homosexual mind control procedure by these criminals.
Because already the communist agents, the New York, Brooklyn, New Jersey mob, were already training Mao. Mao was trained in Paris. So was, you know, the one in Cambodia. What's his name? I can't think of his name. The one who was Pol Pot.
Yeah.
They were homosexually, bless their little hearts, by priests. They were wonderful little boys sent there, you know, turned, which is the word, you know, when they believe their mothers, and then all of a sudden the world's horrible, and then they have these wonderful friends who are going to make them leaders.
Yeah.
They're turned psychologically, and it's a pattern. And so this is why it's so important to know what they are doing to innocent little boys in the Army and the Marine Corps today.
In her 8 hours of interview, she lets out a lot of accusations, and she accuses a lot of high-ranking government officials of a lot of serious crimes. She does not show any signs of hesitation or fear, except when asked one particular question. In this next segment, she is explaining that both her uncle and her husband were involved in secret weapon sales to a certain country for the joint. Which country? And who is the joint? This is the only issue that she hesitates to talk about. However, after saying the Z word, she returns to normal and resumes her accusations of murder, corruption, and sexual perversion.
You know, selling weapons to whatever country. I know the country, but in other words, they were doing work for the joint under the table all these years.
Okay, and directly under whose instructions to sell these weapons? Do you know that?
Yeah.
Okay, and who would that be?
Well, it's the Israeli Zionist group in New York.
Mossad? No.
Well,
what would they
yeah,
call
but
themselves?
everybody thinks Mossad, like they think CIA is just a bogus sort of thing. It's really Army intelligence that does just about everything. They run a lot of the psychological profiling, which is done at Quantico with the FBI. It's all a very small group. Harvard professors connected with, you know, the Tavistock and Dar es Salaam, and there's a sexual perversion group in Vienna and one in Colorado. I think that little girl was part of that experiment, you know, who was
John
murdered.
Benet Ramsey?
Yeah, yeah, because I had some...
Well, you know, that raises an interesting point, because here's a high-profile murder that goes nowhere. No investigation, nobody's pinned. It just goes on and on and on.
The parents are involved in that program.
But somebody higher
High
up
level.
is protecting them.
Absolutely.
And the same thing that you're describing about the military.
Sure.
If you're in the clique, you can get away with murder.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Murder, literally murder.
As many women do, she would introduce people to one another to help them find friends. She helped both her husband and one of her friends from school meet a man named T. Parker Host. She later decided that Parker Host was connected with organized crime. However, her friend from school married him anyway.
This is his wife, Anne, and I introduced him to her.
Good work.
She's my school friend, you know.
Is she still married to him?
Yeah, I mean, he's loaded. You know, she wants a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Her uncle is one of the guys who went to the moon, Collins.
She mentions that her friend is related to Michael Collins, who went to the moon on Apollo 11. If you believe NASA sent people to the moon, take a look at my science challenge at my website. 6 groups of astronauts were sent to the moon, but not one of them saw stars. NASA